This part of the building was separated by a small interior courtyard, usually very muddy, upon which the accommodation erected later for the servants looked out. The kitchen came next, and adjoining that, a little square apartment where Las Casas resided through a trapdoor in the ceiling of which, and by means of a rope ladder, Emmanuel de Las Casas entered a loft in which he could just about stretch himself. On the other side, the three Montsalons, father, mother, and a little boy of 4 years, had full possession of 3 rooms: a bedroom, even larger than the emperor's, a hall, and a study. For a moment, while awaiting the construction between the kitchen and the building intended for the Montsalons, of 3 rooms for the 2 Las Casas and their servant, 2 for General Gorgo, 1 for O'Meara, and 1 for the service officer, these last 3 were accommodated in the tent. The servants had lodging in the lofts, which had been properly floored, but where they could stand upright only underneath the angle of a roof, and where the heat was intolerable. Later, they were provided with bedrooms and a dining room on the ground floor. When the emperor took up his abode here, there was beyond the old house only the wing built by the admiral's orders, and comprising 2 apartments overlooking each other. This projection came in the middle of a fairly long and narrow main building, which upon its other side looked out upon the courtyard of the under-servants, with the kitchen and the other offices some short distance away was a little house built for the Montsalons. The Bertrands were at the moment a mile from there, at Hud's Gate, where their establishment was but tolerably convenient, but where they were secure from daily quarrels. Later they came near and inhabited a little house which was built for them 300 yards from the present abode of the emperor, much nearer the better situated and better looking house which took 4 years to build for them, but which he never occupied. The comparative isolation of the Grand Marshal led to complications detrimental to the emperor's peace. At that distance, Bertrand could not properly run the business of the household, and no opportunity was lost of relieving him of all the duty, while they allowed him to retain both distinction of that office and, as Las Casas put it, the supervision and superintendence of everything on a large scale. Montsalon assumed control of all the domestic affairs. Gorgo directed the stables. Las Casas attended to the furniture and the interior administration of the parts to be furnished. This last business seemed to him to have much in common with domestic affairs, and he decided that collaboration with these latter would be so advantageous to the common welfare that he all the more anticipated he would be able to be relieved of it, which was not difficult and did not take long. Montsalon then found himself responsible for all the duties surrendered by Bertrand and Las Casas, and excepting the stables, he reigned supreme. He alone negotiated with the contractors and gave orders. He alone drew up complaints regarding the food, the meat, the poultry, and vegetables, and he was wonderfully skillful in anything pertaining to provisions and the upkeep of a house. And since he aimed at being provided against alarming emergencies, he made himself not only personally ridiculous by his despair if they were a dish short, and by his exultation if he discovered an expert kitchen maid, but he led the emperor into recriminations from which the Grand Marshal and Yves and Gorgo strove to dissuade him, and which seemed to the English so much less interesting in that they knew perfectly well how temperate the emperor was, and rightly attributed the indiscretion of such protestations to the proper quarter. Montsalon alone was responsible for the appalling wastage which took place in the house, and which a better administration would have prevented, by means of which the emperor might very differently have added strength to his legitimate complaints, and at the same time might have raised certain arguments with his jailers, under which existing circumstances carried no weight. Everyone depended upon Montsalon. Gorgo, who breakfasted in his own room, and as often as not dined there too. The Bertrands also, who, living apart, nevertheless received certain dishes from Longwood. Las Casas made no complaint and adopted the attitude of approval to everything, but O'Meara talked and at the same time noted Masson's designs in order to ridicule him. It drove Las Casas to write, "All these arrangements, however convenient, did not fail to sow among us germs of estrangement, which quickly took root and soon blossomed. One found that he had lost, another wanted to add too much splendor to his office, yet another found himself wronged in rearrangement. Acting under orders from Masson, Cipriani, maitre d'hotel, assisted him in the distribution of food for Longwood as well as Hud's Gate. Balcom became purveyor, and in the words of Marchand, the allowances of the government appeared adequate. Sometimes complaints had been made concerning their quality, but in general blame had rather to be laid on the conditions than upon the admiral, who, when informed of the affair, remedied it as soon as possible. The wastage was such that a little later Gourgaud said to the emperor, "We do not drink 17 bottles of wine, nor eat 88 pounds of meat and 9 fowl." The emperor would willingly have inaugurated a scheme of money for food, 8 francs a day for each French servant and 3 francs for the others. But Masson dissuaded him from the only system which might have obviated complaints and investigations. The stables of which Gourgaud had charged contained 10 horses, 4 from the Cape for carriages, and 6 saddle horses, 4 of which were from the Cape, and 2 from the imperial stables, Frigent and Vizier. Vizier, whose portrait had been painted by Horace Vernet and cost 250 francs in 1813, was most probably one of the horses offered by the Sultan to the Emperor in 1808. It was taken to England after Napoleon's death, and there it died. Its skin was stuffed, and after many adventures is today in the Musée d'Armée in Paris. The admiral had bought an open carriage at the Cape for the emperor's use, the only one to be found on the island. The emperor provided himself with a number of little carriages, in particular for the use of Madame Bertrand, under Gourgaud's orders. The 2 Archambaults were the coachmen who drove Napoleon, and they had with them 6 sailors from the Northumberland, dressed in the imperial livery, who quickly became expert drivers. The drive at full speed around the enclosure where the emperor had the right to walk without escort later became the only exercise he took. He drove Madame de Montalon or sometimes Madame Bertrand. The occupants asked no questions. It was the emperor who gave instructions. Ordinarily, one would go to Jamestown on horseback, and so it was necessary to send for Gourgaud, which became a regular practice. He gave permission or refused according as he felt, because each one wanted to be master, and it pressed the fact upon him. And since the cost of the stables was somewhat alarming, the emperor always wanted to economize on the fodder of the livery, and Gourgaud became exasperated. In the kitchen, where Lepage became overcome with the work, 3 sailors were employed. With one of the pantries, some Chinese were added to their number and later took their places. For the wardrobe, Marchand had obtained a Chinese boy for the emperor. Marchand's attendance was continuous day and night. Saint-Denis and Novarez on alternate days remained in the little corridor leading to the bathroom and slept there. Santini was entrusted with outside duties and took up his abode in the first apartment, then called the map room to open the drawing room doors. There was therefore, with the consent of the British government and by the kind of officers of the admiral, a kind of suite around the emperor. Sir George Cockburn was willing to allow the emperor anything that could add to his comfort, and after busying himself most actively in having erected the buildings intended personally for Napoleon, he was no less keen to help in arranging the rooms to be occupied by the followers, redoubling his efforts on behalf of Bertrand. He lent tents for the servants, and at the same time told off sailors from his flagship to help so much, so that in a few months he succeeded in providing shelter for everyone, actually under roofs of tarred boards and between walls, and the Massons, Gourgaud, and Las Casas were at length accommodated fairly comfortably, while the Grand Marshal left Hud's Gate and resided within the enclosure about 300 yards from the main building. It was no concern of the admiral if Bertrand, maintaining his customary independence as at Hud's Gate, refused, despite the wish expressed by the emperor, to dine with him every evening, and excused himself upon his state of health and the careless habits of Madame Bertrand in whatever concerned them. As with the rest, the admiral showed magnanimity But if he showed himself sympathetic with one in misfortune, he felt himself no less obliged by his duty as an officer and his integrity as an Englishman to carry out his orders when he was dealing with the guard for the prisoner and the precautions prescribed by the ministry.